Here to cover all things crime, history, and politics, we are at the desk. I'm your host, Sophia Tournay, and in today's episode, we will be talking about the critical issue of election integrity, the strengths and weaknesses of the popular TV show Criminal Minds, Christopher Columbus and the plight of modern Native Americans, and the latest news in international politics. Now, come take a seat with us at the desk. Welcome back to ATD. First, it's time to send it over to the crime panel to analyze the popular TV show Criminal Minds. Over to you, Savannah.
Thanks, Sophia. Welcome to our debate segment. Tonight, we will be dissecting the fascinating series Criminal Minds. Here with us, we have Eva and Kara, who support the show for its ability to raise awareness about different crimes and the victims involved. Facing off against them are Megan and Sam, who argue the forensic silence is completely inaccurate. Who will come out on top in this criminally good debate? Let's find out. Eva, why don't you start off by giving us a general overview of the show?
Savannah, I would love to. Let's get into this. Alrighty. So Criminal Minds is an American police crime drama television series created and produced by Jeff Davis, and it's going on its 18th season, which is pretty good for a show, including the spinoff. So obviously very popular. And just to give a few key points before we really dive into this debate of why we like the show, are the complexity, the diverse characters, a lot of good character development, a lot of good realism and research, diverse storylines, and at the end of the day, it's an entertainment-based show. That is what it is made for.
Absolutely. And starting off with a lot of this complexity that comes with the characters and the character development, this show was made in the early 2000s, and all of the super diverse issues and trauma that is represented between all of the characters is very inclusive, and it's also very inspiring. You know, when you're sitting, you're watching the show and you see the characters are struggling with the same things you do, seeing that be very normalized on television instead of being stigmatized as well.
Yeah, when you can feel represented by something, I feel like that gives you a connection to that show, and that's why it gained a lot of popularity.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well,
Here we go, guys.
I personally don't believe that we should be making crimes entertainment. I feel like we see a slippery slope when it comes to making realistic crime dramas or even crime documentaries on Netflix like Dahmer, Menendez Brothers. You can see a little bit of a slippery slope when it goes into people, instead of just watching it, they start to admire certain characters in the show that shouldn't be. And so I think that is one of the main problems when it comes to this show. I also believe that the forensic science is just so completely inaccurate. And if you want to, really show off what it's like working in the FBI for BAU, why are we making it so quick to get, answers to questions that take days, weeks, even months to answer?
Yeah, I also wanted to cover it from an FBI perspective. So the behavioral analysis unit in the actual FBI, in the show, the behavioral analysis unit kind of dissects what criminal it is, but then they also go out and solve the crimes. In real life, the behavioral analysis unit does not go out and solve the crimes. One other thing that's completely inaccurate is in the real criminal justice system, crimes take months or even sometimes years to solve. In this show, a single episode's a different crime. And I also want to cover kind of romanticizing criminals. People are dressing up as Dahmer for Halloween. People are dressing up as the Menendez brothers for Halloween. Same thing with the Criminal Minds show. These criminals are kind of taken from real life examples, and it gives those criminals kind of the light that they wish when they were committing the crimes. So one, I think is inaccurate, but I also hate the romanticization, if that's a word, of actual criminals.
Well, all I'm hearing over there is a snooze fest. I'm not going to lie to you. That sounds boring. If we were waiting full on weeks to get one answer about one crime, who's watching that? Who was watching that show?
Absolutely.
I mean, they need fresh crimes every episode to keep it entertaining. I mean, that's the point of the show. You want to say something on that? But.
Yeah, well, I think the most interesting thing you said is obviously the romanticization of stuff about crimes and criminals, and obviously with kind of all of the buzz that's going around the Menendez brothers and their new show with Ryan Murphy and everything. But this show isn't about a criminal, as in, Dahmer. That's obviously about Jeffrey Dahmer. The Menendez brothers, that's about Lyle and Eric. This show is centered around the FBI agents. So you don't really have to worry about anyone looking up to or romanticizing any of these criminals, because have you ever seen someone walk around and dress up as a criminal from the Criminal Minds show? No, absolutely not. They're going to dress up as Dr. Spencer Reed, or they're going to, dress up as Emily Prentice, the FBI agents who run that show. And if you're going to dress up as anyone, obviously with this show, you're going to dress up as the people who catch those criminals, which is important. So sure, you can leave the people to stay with Ryan Murphy and dress up as the criminals, but that's not really applicable in this case because, while yes, they do solve crimes and they deal with criminals, it's a show about the FBI.
I want to go against your point there. And that is a show about the FBI, but it's completely unrealistically depicting also the FBI. I know people that want to enter the field. Oh, why are you majoring in this? Because of shows like Criminal Minds. When they enter this field, that is completely unrealistic. Becoming an FBI agent takes years to become an FBI agent. They're dressing up as FBI agents, but they're dressing up as their false reality of what an FBI agent really is. Like in the show, the criminals are kind of a threat to the FBI agents. In real life, that doesn't really happen. The FBI is so kind of under a lot of security. The criminals don't go against the FBI. That is unrealistic. Also, when you're dressing up as an FBI agent for Halloween, that's not really, that's also kind of impersonating an FBI agent, which you don't really see people doing because that is kind of against the law of impersonating a federal agent.
Yeah, why can't you have some fun with it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a show. It's fiction-based.
So, Sam, you argue that shows like Criminal Minds do the criminal justice system a disservice.
Yes, completely a disservice. Going into the criminal justice system, like I mentioned before, cases take months and years to even come about. Also, the agents that kind of arrest the criminals aren't the same agents necessarily that are working on the case. Cases are assigned to one agent specifically, and then they are, when they're going to combat the criminals, when they're going to arrest the criminals, multiple agents kind of come and help them. Then they take that all the way through. They go to court. They do interrogations. They do things like that. That is not depicted on the show realistically whatsoever. So it does a disservice to the criminal justice system and kind of gives people a false reality of what it actually is. The only way to really see how the criminal justice system works is either going to court realistically, watching ID discovery shows that kind of take your walk through a case, not watching shows like Criminal Minds that gives the American people or the whole world an unrealistic expectation of what the criminal justice system is and how it really works.
And I totally understand that, but at the end of the day, I totally agree with you. I do think there are parts of the show that are unrealistic, and I'm going to give you that. Sure, right? But I think at the end of the day, this is a fiction-based show, and we see so many things circulating on the TV that are realistic, or they do cover real crimes, such as documentaries. So I feel like it's nice for people to have an outlet who love crime to be able to kind of watch it and be like, I have that security that this isn't real life, but I can enjoy kind of like the mystery of it, like the murders, the serial killers. Like I can kind of enjoy that aspect of crime without having to be like, oh, well, this happened and this is a lot to think about. Like this is weighing on me. Because I know personally, when I watch a documentary, that sticks with me. I'm thinking about it. I'm like, this actually happened. It's honestly, I can't watch it at night. It's hard for me to watch. But I feel like if I'm watching a show like Criminal Minds, I can kind of like let myself dive into the characters. And another thing with the FBI where you're saying, oh, well, this team would go get them, but this team would kind of stay back. Like, I get that. But oh my gosh, then we have 40 characters running around the show and we can't keep track of anyone. We kind of have to keep a main group set in the show so we can fall in love with these lovable characters.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone is obsessed with this show and loves these characters. And I feel like you kind of have to have that crew to kind of explore the dynamics of those characters and what they do in the show.
Well, Eva, do you think there's any shows or documentaries in particular that you think are better?
I mean, yeah, I'm just going to kind of stand true to the point of like, there's so many good crime documentaries out there that are based on real life cases, O.J. Simpson, the Menendez brothers, and they follow these real court cases and give you actual facts. So I feel like if that's what you're looking for, go watch that. I mean, that's what I watch if I'm looking for something realistic. But at the end of the day, Criminal Minds is kind of supposed to be fiction. It's supposed to be fantasy for people who just like enjoy that aspect of crime, but also enjoy the fiction aspect. So in my opinion, I think not necessarily that documentaries are better, just kind of what are you looking for? Are you looking for like actual facts? You want to educate yourself? Or are you looking for yourself a way to unwind on a Saturday night and enjoy some crime?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, that's how I view it.
No,
So-
absolutely. I agree with you. And obviously, this is TV. You know, you have to suspend a little bit of disbelief with some of these things because it is obviously it's fictional and it is a little bit far-fetched at times. Absolutely. You can say that with a bunch of different TVs and movies, even with certain stuff in social media, you know, with going back to stuff like Photoshop and advertisements. In the world that we're living in, yes, some things are going to be faked a little bit. Some things are going to be tweaked here and there simply for the purpose of entertainment. But just because it may not be 100% plausible and realistic doesn't inherently make it bad. It just makes it interesting because it's entertainment.
But I feel like when you reach a certain level of unrealistic in a show that you keep picking up on, you start to not as enjoy it as much. I loved watching Criminal Minds when I was in high school, and now that I'm like rewatching it, I've learned more, and I'm looking at them enter onto crime scenes that just happened. They somehow flew across the country, and all of a sudden they're there hours after this crime happened. They're going onto the scene all willy-nilly, and you look around, and there is no signs of crime scene there. You don't see the tickets for every blood spatter and every trace like of evidence that you have there. No, they're just walking up to the car that's covered in blood, and they're like, yeah, it was this. I know what the profile is of this person just because of this one instance. Does that not sound a little too unrealistic to you? Do you really want to continuously watch something that, you know, even if you're not overthinking about it in the background, you still notice the small things and you're like, okay, guys, what are we doing here? Are we really acting like it's this quick to get evidence that takes months to get back? Like, you can make one call to one girl and be able to get whatever you need. Then why do we have cold cases? Then why do we have this? It's a slippery slope of making crimes look like it's so easy to solve when it takes so much, especially if you are reaching out to the FBI level and you are outsourcing to the FBI because you need help, whether it's finding a body, whether it's finding out a perpetrator. I understand that these people are very, very smart. That's not taking away from their character. These are well-written characters, but sometimes there's things in these episodes that where I'm like, there's absolutely no way they just got this. There's absolutely no way it takes them 3 seconds to completely read the Zodiac code, like in an episode from season 7 where Reed, I understand he has a photographic memory, but we're really just taking a few seconds to just decode something completely.
Season 7, episode 11.
Yeah.
I do know what you're talking about. Yeah.
But also, doesn't that seem like we're romanticizing the Zodiac killer a little bit?
How so? No, we're just using it as a foundation and kind of adding our own little like flair to it.
Isn't that what writers are for? To create an original plot, and instead of stealing from an actual true crime that happened that we should not be continuously writing about and romanticizing and inspiring people out there.
You have to think of the victims too.
Okay,
what's your
victims
from
Okay, but how many people are actually watching this show? Like, I'm going to go out tomorrow and solve a murder. I'm going to go solve a crime. No one's sitting actively watching Criminal Minds like, oh, well, see ya, I actually got to go solve this murder that happened in my town.
Yeah.
I feel like that's never happening. That's so unrealistic.
I would hope not.
I would really hope
You
not.
would
That'd
be
be
surprised
crazy.
with what criminals watch and what criminals get their inspiration from.
Are criminals watching Criminal Minds?
I'm sure.
Maybe they are. But you know what?
Next episode.
We'll get into that. But I just really don't think it's enough to the extent where it's like an issue to have this show on the air. Like,
No.
I totally get what you're saying, but I just don't feel like enough people are sitting there. The majority of the population who watch Criminal Minds, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like are not actively preparing their next murder. Like, you know?
So far, I haven't had that issue while I've been watching the show. But if anything happens,
Let us know.
Let us know.
Yeah.
Keep me
you'll
updated.
see me on news. Just let me know. You'll see me. I'm sure something will happen.
And it'll be solved in a day because that's how actual crime looks like. I mean, compared to what we see in Criminal Minds, every episode there's a new serial killer. Are there really that many serial killers out there?
There are actually.
I mean, and I kind of want to give the point of like, I personally like that every episode kind of wraps it up for me. I don't want to end on a cliffhanger. I kind of
Yeah.
want my episode, my crime to be wrapped up so that I can look forward to next week and diving into something different. And I feel
Something
like
new every time.
yes, and
Absolutely.
Serial killer every time.
yes, and I also
Yeah.
like exactly, and I
Having a
kind
new
of
show every time, not
Yeah,
a
at this
serial
point.
killer every time.
yeah, but I like my show neatly wrapped up. I can finish my episode, mind appeased. I'm not thinking about it, and I kind of like how they also bring characters back around into the show
Mhm.
and kind of different cameos. Like I love that, and I feel like for me personally, that's what makes the show so good. I mean, if we dragged out a crime for a whole season, I personally would be very bored.
We get bored of it. Absolutely. Yeah. And you guys keep bringing up the little inaccuracies that this show has, and totally can appreciate that. But I mean, I'm looking at a list here of over 25 episodes that have been directly inspired. Some even are a mirror image of actual crimes that happen. So how many inaccuracies can it actually have if experts say these crimes are almost perfectly represented in the show?
But, since this is made for an audience
Yeah.
and it's a recreation of these crimes, what if the victim of that crime sees this? Do you think they're prepared for that? What about people who have experienced these before? I understand that most of the time they're probably not going out of their way to watch a show like this,
Mhm.
but can't that be a little dangerous to rehash memories like that, especially when you're not expecting it? I understand, like I said, if you're going out of your way to watch Criminal
Less
Minds,
dangerous and more impactful. You want to talk about the show that just happened with the Menendez brothers? That case is getting reopened because of the piqued interest in Ryan Murphy's show, and has just brought in a wave of support for the Menendez brothers. So sure, it can be a little dangerous, but they might get out of jail after being in there for almost 30 years, and that is all because of the show
It's bringing
that
more
Ryan
awareness.
Murphy created.
Right, that's the whole point. It's like bringing awareness to these characters, bringing
Yeah.
awareness to, like the minds of villains. Like it's bringing
All
awareness.
right. Well, unfortunately, ladies, that is all the time we have for today.
It's okay. It's
Let
okay.
us know who you side with for this debate. Back to you, Sophia.
Thanks, Savannah. Stay tuned for our politics panel as they discuss international and national election integrity. We'll be right back at the desk. We are once again back at the desk. It's time to send it over to the politics panel to discuss election integrity. Over to you, Francie.
Thanks, Sophia. We are diving straight into arguably one of the most critical issues of an election, integrity, both internationally and with our own borders. We have seen through the U.S. intelligence community confirming interference from Russia. But beyond that, there's the 2020 Georgia case where a grand jury indicted Donald Trump for attempting to overturn the state's election results. Mail-in ballots have become another topic of conversation, creating a partisan divide in how Americans see the fairness and security of our elections. All that and more here at the desk. Now, Ryan, I'm going to start with you. With Russia's past, do you think that there is potential for a significant interference in this 2024 election, and why?
So the answer is there is potential, not significant. And I will tell you why. Because with the age of and the growth of technology also comes in at the same time, because of Donald Trump and his concerns about the election, a lot of election security and a lot of paper ballots. States like Alabama, for instance, are using paper ballots more. And people are so concerned about election integrity that government officials that are being elected, regardless of what they thought of 2020, are really concerned about the security and American citizens voting. So I don't think there's going to be a significant amount of Russian interference. But I will say this, there is definitely a possibility, and there have definitely been some concerns about it. And I think that it's important that the FBI keeps their eyes open because they've been busy lately with assassination attempts and problems with artificial intelligence, computer hacking, etc. We need to have safe elections. And I'm saying this as somebody who's an independent, and I know for a fact that both of you who are a little bit more to the left would agree. And I obviously know that Jackson is very excited to talk about the importance of the safety of elections here and abroad. So I don't want to say there's a good significant chance because of the precautions that we are now taking, but don't take my word on that. Anything is possible. And the sky's the limit when it comes to technology. And with that being said, the sky's the limit to how we use technology and how we manipulate it.
Yeah, I would say that with technology, that's a thumbs up, but it's also a thumbs down, right? When you talk about artificial intelligence, as we're increasing our technology and the better we get with our software and all that jazz, that also means there's also a precaution of the negative parts of it. And yeah, I mean, when we talk about Russia and the history with us and our election interference, with Iran, where do you see that?
Yeah, so Iran has actually started interfering with social media campaigns and trying to spread disinformation, which in the day and age of technology, as you guys were talking about, is so easy to come across and not as easy to distinguish from actual facts and real information that's important for people. And when I was younger and this whole thing came out with Russian interference in the election, I kind of thought it was like a bit dumb. I was like, why would people all the way in Russia be worried about what we in the US are doing all the way over here with our elections? Like, that doesn't make sense. But I think it really speaks to kind of the importance of the US as in the international system, because people trying to come and mess with the elections here because they have goals and they want to control our politics, our politicians, to move to their aims. And with Iran, everything that's going on in the Middle East, all the proxy wars that are happening aside from the Israel-Palestine conflict, I think it's important for them to make sure they have somebody that they see as being malleable and amenable to their own agenda. So I think we really do have to be vigilant about this, because at the end of the day, like, people in America are voting for American issues. We're not voting so that people in other countries can, mess with our stuff. So I think it's very important. I think once we get to the domestic part, that's when we can speak a little bit more in depth. But for now, I think our cybersecurity officials need to be at the top of their game.
Absolutely. Well, so you want to talk about Iran or Russia or both? I'll do
You
both.
can go
So,
wherever you
Can you
want.
sprinkle a
Josh.
little China in there too?
Yeah,
Maybe-
I got
maybe
a little bit of
perhaps
that
China.
too.
I'm more interested in Iran right now because Iran was found to have sent some emails from the Trump campaign, or hacked into the Trump campaign, sent some emails to the Biden campaign when Biden was still in the race. And there's no real evidence that the Biden campaign actually received these or used them. But even still, that's still a very concerning precedent that a foreign country, especially one that is, not really a friend like Iran, would try to, get involved with our election like that, especially with a former president, his current campaign, and try to manipulate the election, because that Iran's interests are not in the United States' interests, and they're going to go with the candidate they feel is better to manipulate, and that might be an indicator right there. So I think that we need to really lock in on the AI, for one thing, because in 2016, artificial intelligence was not the same. I mean, there was a little bit of it, but it was nowhere
Every
near.
single day it gets better.
It gets better and better. It's just rapidly improving technology, and every single day it gets more powerful. And I think especially with the electronic voting, when it's not paper ballots, those can be super easy to manipulate. And we'll get into mail-in voting later, but I'm super worried about the computer voting, and I really would question security as far as international interference in that.
I did see an interesting statistic. And again, none of us are AI experts. None of us have completed any classes on AI or really understand the depth of technology, nor does somebody twice as smart as us. Let's be honest. There are people who exist who are twice as smart as all of us. Sorry to hurt our egos.
Hey,
There
Not
is.
many.
Sorry.
Elon Musk's
Not
one of
many.
them, yes.
Not many. True. But what I was going to say is that there is some research being done, and NBC has found that countries like China are not as interested in the presidential election anymore due to the fact that people like Donald Trump and Kamala Harris and the FBI are keeping their eye out. They're interested in the local elections. They're interested in manipulating those state legislators that can grant their companies land, those companies that say they're not affiliated but actually are. They're interested in those congressmen and congresswomen who can vote in their favor on the main stage. They're interested in those elections that almost like sneak below national television, because those are not going to get as much interest as the presidential election. I mean, you have people like Donald Trump screaming that elections were rigged, elections were stolen, dead people were voted. China's not going to want to get their hands directly into that. China's going to want to find a way to manipulate other elections that can have the same impact.
Yeah, it's a smart strategy for sure if they
Very
want to
smart
disrupt
strategy.
the American civil process.
Absolutely.
Obviously, going after the president's the most stereotypical thing they could do. Go after the most powerful person on paper. But obviously, Donald Trump has obviously raised suspicions about election integrity, and they don't want to really get involved with that as much. They'd rather go after these smaller elections, so that way they can really get into like the depths of our laws and try to mess with the United States,
Right.
essentially.
Nobody is investigating a congressman or congresswoman's race against, rather that be an incumbent or a state legislator. Doesn't matter who they're running against. Nobody's investigating that as much as they're investigating the Trump-Kamala Harris results.
And that raises the point of the importance of local elections, because now if foreign entities like China are coming in and trying to mess around with local elections, that's how you know that that's where the real work happens. Because at the end of the day, we watch the presidential debates, we watch the presidential race, but the real work, the real laws happen at the local level. And so if people are more aware and more vigilant about what's going on at the state level, local level, municipal, whatever you want to call it, that's when you're going to see foreign entities kind of back off a little bit. But until we get to that state, I think it's going to be a lot easier for them, especially with AI and China and their microchips. Like, they are like a technological juggernaut over there.
Right.
So,
And of course,
it's
there's
scary.
possible stealing data through TikTok.
Yeah.
All these crazy
yeah,
things
TikTok.
that are.
We forgot about TikTok.
So these issues that have been raised in the last couple of years, really, you never really know how they're going to use that against U.S. elections, whether it be presidential
Well,
or
that's
local or
campaign
state.
interference. That's a
Yes.
whole other topic. This issue of other countries interfering is bigger than any one man or woman. This is something that as technology develops and as countries develop with that technology, the manipulation that they can afford to do is dangerously stronger than the previous time.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people need to understand that this is something where a lot of money needs to be invested into organizations like the FBI that really need to be on the top of their game during election season, because of the fact that not only do we not know how much China is developing, but the AI itself is just not comprehensible by one individual.
I mean, now they're making, AI edits of Trump and Biden playing games together. And like that might seem like a lot, but you couldn't do that 5 years ago. It's just little things like that show how the technology is improving
It's scary.
over time.
But you could also there's now all of a sudden this thing where you can make manufactured podcasts. Microsoft, you can make AI podcasts. You can make it as if two people are talking. It actually exists.
And
It's
the
through notebook.
voice replication
Right.
is insane.
I mean,
Like,
there are hints of, failures in technology here and there, but it's going to improve. They're going to be able to bring more voices in. God forbid, all of a sudden, George Washington's voice is going to be back. Like, technology is so smart, and it is developing quicker than elections happen.
Of course.
now, enough of the technology. Well, I guess we're still kind of continuing it on. Let's talk a little bit about Georgia and Trump. How are we feeling on that, guys?
Well, so obviously Donald Trump raised a lot of concerns, whether it be in Georgia, Arizona, some other states, Wisconsin. I mean, Georgia was the primary state, but he raised a lot of concerns about, the super high voter turnout and the super high vote to registering ratio. I mean, you saw the 2020 election had the highest voter turnout in a national election since 1900, which is kind of strange. You would think that the 2016 election would get more because there was a little more momentum, I would argue, it seemed like, in that race. But there was a super high turnout in this race. You saw Joe Biden get over 81 million votes total.
Most amount of votes ever.
Most amount of votes ever. And
From a
it's
presidential
over
candidate.
74 million for Trump, the loser of that
Trump,
election.
most an incumbent's ever gotten in the presidential spot.
Just an immense turnout for two old white guys. Let's be honest here. So, I mean, you wouldn't think that this election would get that high of a turnout, but it's just so strange. And that's one of the concerns I think Trump had. Because I remember he said during his speech on January 6th, he said, my electoral counter guy, whatever you want to call him, he said, if I get 65 million votes, I win the election. He got over 74 million and lost. So I think that's where his concerns were. And I mean, we can argue all day whether it was stolen or whether it wasn't. The evidence right now is indicating that it wasn't necessarily stolen. But yes, there was a lot of strange things that happened. The mail-in ballots coming in late, the fact that there was about 46% of the votes were mail-in ballots. You don't know what can happen through the process of mail-in voting. So it was just a very unprecedented election, I would argue.
What does my electoral counter guy? I'm just curious. What do you? I'm assuming you're referring to Joe
Yes.
Biden.
No, not Joe Biden. No, not one of Donald Trump's employees. I forget the name of the position, but the guy who is his electoral expert. I couldn't think of the
Not Rudy
real-
Giuliani.
No, not Rudy
No.
Giuliani. No.
I imagine the guy that's like kind of helping him predict like what
Yes,
he needs
his
to win.
what I am struggling right now.
I couldn't tell you.
Let's use the word the experts.
The experts.
The
He said
experts.
65 million would get him the race. Obviously, he won close to 63 million in 2016, but it didn't, and that's where some of the concern was from American voters.
Yeah, and I think the really interesting thing about the 2020 election is we haven't seen this type of like outrage over votes since I want to say maybe like Al Gore's election. And because people generally in the US, we generally tend to think that our elections are safe. And I think that's why Donald Trump's claims were
Dangerous.
shook so many people to their core, because it's like, not to be like an ultra patriot, but like, this is America. Like, this is the last place that you would expect to have cases of voter fraud, to have cases of election integrity being eroded. So that's why, like, I think it's become such a big issue now, especially with mail-in ballots. You see a huge divide between Democrats and Republicans, with Democrats feeling much more secure about the integrity and the validity of mail-in ballots than Republicans. This is kind of shifting a little bit now, but there's a lot more security on the Democrat side that, we need to push for more early access, for more mail-in ballots, because this is how we get more voter turnout. And the Republicans, which I think is to an extent valid, are saying, but this could lead to a slippery slope of our elections being messed with from the home stage.
Yes.
I just wanted to note on that. There was a statistic from PBS that said 58% of likely Trump voters say in the latest poll that they will show up in person on election day. Only 16% of Trump supporters said they plan to vote by mail. And looking at that, I think we can all agree. I think it's from the rhetoric from Trump, the constant reminders about how he firmly doesn't believe. And that goes for generally for both sides. I think if Kamala kept saying that,
though, do you think that Democrat voters are going to vote more mail-in, like significantly more?
Yeah.
Because last time in 2020 they did. It was around 58% of Biden voters actually did mail-in.
Which brings in what you wanted to talk about, which I really think deserves some time, is the incident in Georgia, the call with Raffensperger.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about that a little bit.
It's going to little detail.
He was pushing for votes that didn't exist, and he was also claiming people who died voted, which wasn't the case. They
It
found
was 23.
yeah, they found 23 people, not the 13,000 that he wanted or the 12,000. I believe the number was 11,776.
Numbers.
Sorry.
Um,
You said that.
There were a lot of claims that were made. And look, I saw some strange things happen on election night. Obviously, the evidence, what happens is with evidence is it's innocent until proven guilty. So obviously, you assume the election is safe unless there is significant evidence that it was not safe.
Well,
So
the election's not one person.
right. But I'm saying, but the election itself, though, you assume that it's safe unless you find significant evidence that it's not safe.
Right.
So they were not able to find these dead voters or these dumped off mail-in ballots, all the things that were being
Right.
accused. So they were not able to overturn the results, essentially. But it's just still strange to me how such a high turnout happened in that election. That's my only real kind of gripe with that.
All right, so let's
I
break.
wouldn't
Let's,
really gripe with that just
Right.
because, like, you know, you were saying that the 2016 election had a little bit more momentum. You know, we had the first possibility of having a female
and the first
president.
outsider to the political sphere, Donald Trump.
Right, exactly. Which I could agree with you then. But I think, I don't know if complaining about, or not complaining, but like taking issue with high voter turnout would be like kind of relevant, just because even though the momentum for the 2016 election was high, I would argue that the 2020 was even higher, just because Donald Trump's 4 years in office were so polarizing and
Mhm.
so divisive that so many people were like, all right, like some people were either like, we got to get this guy out or we got to keep this guy in.
Yeah, there
So-
was no in between.
And
Yeah,
let's
I
put
wouldn't say there's a
ourselves.
If you were in
correlation
between,
there.
it was because you
Yeah.
didn't know any better.
Let's put ourselves in the moment for a second, Jackson. COVID-19 happened. People are scared to leave their houses,
Yeah.
right? And if you're comfortable enough to leave your houses, big cities like your Portlands, like your Minneapolis and St. Paul's, I mean, they're in the middle of riots, right? I mean, people wanted to see rather change, or they wanted to see more stability if there was no change. So people were very passionate about their vote. Not only that, that's why we saw the mail-in ballots. I think for the most part is because of the safety concern, touching things that other people touched, being within 6 feet, they said. Whatever you want the reason to be, I think there was a real concern about health, and I think that affected the reason why the turnout
Yeah.
in person was different.
Yeah.
If that's
I just think it's a super, just a massive difference. I mean, you saw Donald Trump. He had his problems in office. He had his controversial moments, but he improved by over 11 million voters around there. And that just, it just seems kind of strange to me. But obviously the evidence is not there that the election should have been overturned. So I'm not going to, press it too hard. I'm just saying that what I saw when Trump was leading all the way till 3 a.m. or 2 a.m., the whole election process was kind of strange to me.
But you could admit
But-
that he lost, right?
Yes, I
Yeah.
can admit that there probably wasn't enough to overturn the results. Yes.
I mean, when it comes down to election integrity, I think the biggest thing is that we are a country that takes pride off of the way we work. And the second it gets questioned, I think that's when a lot of other problems filter through. And no matter what happens or in the future whatsoever, we go through things like COVID as a country, we go through other things. I think it's important to,
But we should make sure that the elections are secure.
of course.
We should make sure that they are
100%.
citizens.
They should
Things,
be
just basic things like
100%.
that.
That's
Basic
common-
things
I
like
think
that.
even- I
Everyone
think-
wants safe elections.
I think
I
even
don't know about
calling
that,
the,
Ryan,
the
but-
integrity of elections, I think even calling those into question is dangerous for our elections. honestly.
right. It's yeah. But unfortunately, that's all we have for today. But be sure to tune into more conversations at the desk. Back to you, Sophia.
Thanks, Francie. Stay tuned for our history panel as they discuss the implications of the arrival of European settlers in America. We'll be right back at the desk. We are back at the desk. Now it's time for the history panel as they discuss Christopher Columbus and the plight of modern Native Americans. Over to you, Brandon.
Thanks, Sophia. Howdy, folks, and happy Indigenous Peoples Day. Every day in elementary, middle, and high school, us American students were taught to celebrate Christopher Columbus and his arrival here in America. As we've grown older, though, the rose-tinted glasses have begun to fade away, and now we can see the true implications of the arrival of Europeans to the States. Here at the History Panel, we want to take a deeper look into the full scope of the plight of Native Americans in our country and discuss Columbus, as well as Andrew Jackson's presidency, the Trail of Tears, and the modern-day remaining tribes located on reserves. Although Columbus thought he had found a clever way around the world, there are simply no ways around the mistakes made in the process of founding America. All right, guys, so I want to start us off with a few facts that I found interesting just about the original arrival of Columbus, and we'll get into open discussion. I think, firstly, it's important to note that the term Indians does derive from the fact that he thought he had found India when he had arrived in America. The second thing I wanted to note is that they were not the first people to found the Americas. Most people have heard of Leif Erikson Day, probably from SpongeBob, but they have heard of Leif Erikson Day, and there was a Viking settlement in Newfoundland for quite some time. The other thing I want to note is that America is not the only country that celebrates Columbus Day. There are actually 3 other main areas I found that celebrate Columbus Day. We have Discovery Day in the Bahamas and Colombia. There is Dia de la Raza, or the Day of the Race in Latin America, and we have Hispanic Day in Spain. So yeah, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit more about what you found about Columbus and his arrival.
Yeah, so Columbus actually, when he first landed, it's believed he landed most likely on the Bahamas that you just mentioned. The first people he encountered were the Taino people, and they have been in a process of trying to revive their culture because of the, I want to say almost like desecration that Columbus brought with him. Genocide, literally, that he brought with him. I mean, when he first landed, he saw them and he was like, okay. His first impressions that he wrote down in his little journal travel notebook was that they were nice people, they were generous, and that they did not bear arms. And so he said that they would be easy to dominate. And I just want to take a moment to really unpack the implications of that statement, because why is that the first thing you're thinking about? And I think it really goes to show that, like, when we talk about the discovery of the Americas, it's really important for us to reckon with this history of this kind of white superiority that a lot of European settlers had. Because if your first thought when you meet people that have clothed you, fed you, taken you around their settlements, showed you their children, brought you into their homes, and your first thought is because they don't carry guns, they'll be easy for me to dominate, then I really think it's time for you to rethink your morals. And we can talk a lot about the implications of Christianity within this, which is a bit messy, and I think probably something that will come up in conversation, but the combination of just wanting to the sentiment of wanting to dominate people and then wanting to convert them to a religion, forcibly convert them to a religion that they had no knowledge of, I think is very dangerous. And it's something that gets ignored when we're younger, and even to a certain extent now.
Yeah.
But I think we definitely need to.
And even with the Taino Indians, I think it's interesting to note in his journal, the first day of his arrival in the New World, when he discovered them, he took 6 of them as slaves and wrote down saying that he thought that they would make good slaves as people. And Jamie, what all did you find?
Well, everybody knows the sort of rhyme in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but it almost sort of doesn't quite tell the whole story. In reality, 1492 marked the year of the first of 4 major voyages over into the Caribbean. Excuse me. There's somewhat of a misconstruence that Columbus discovered America, and the way that it's described, it almost makes it seem as though he landed somewhere along the Atlantic coast, like in Jersey or something.
Yeah.
When in reality, he like you said, he landed somewhere in the Bahamas at first, and then later to Hispaniola, which is the island that is shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. I feel like calling it the discovery of America sort of doesn't quite do it justice. If anything, more accurately, I feel like it should be described as the introduction of the then Western world to the Americas.
The further Western world, yeah. It's also important to note that those islands he did become governor of after he discovered them. So it did allow him to transport slaves through that region back over to Europe.
Right.
And he actually ended up transporting most of the 250,000 Taino natives that were there. Only a few hundred survived. And like Yaya said, they are still trying to reclaim their culture. Audrey, what were you able to find?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the way that he was initially seeing these natives was to dominate them, as Yaya said. And I think it is also important to note that the goal of his voyages was to find spices at first. So when he saw a couple natives and he saw that they had gold jewelry, he became transfixed on this. And he would torture Native Americans for their gold. He would cut off hands of those who refused to give up their own. Sometimes he would burn down villages. He was just generally not a menace. Does not even like that makes it sound sillier than it was, but he became a sex trafficker to indigenous girls, specifically between the ages of 8 to 10, because they would bring in the most amount of profit during the transatlantic slave trade. So just generally
terrible
really
person, yeah.
horrible.
And I think something that's important to note too is that if there were ever any rebellion from the Native American people, he would deter that by parading the dead bodies of the people he had slayed in the streets to make sure that no more would do so. Shay, what were you able to find?
So I want to address something that everyone's kind of been talking about. I know, James, you specifically mentioned that the Native American people, I believe Columbus did not discover America, and you're absolutely correct. And I want to piggyback off that and talk about and ask you all a question. Why do we celebrate Christopher Columbus? Because he doesn't have any American values, as we've all discussed. He took away liberty and justice for all, these core values that unite us as Americans. He took these values away. He enslaved people. He was a colonizer, and colonialism is something we fought in the American Revolution. And he didn't even discover America. And, even for purposes of the argument that he did, he didn't really discover it for Americans. He discovered America to exploit the land that we live on today for European wealth. And I just think that we as Americans, we deserve better than to celebrate someone for our discovery that, quite frankly, killed a lot of us. I mean, he killed. So in the year 1492, there was an estimate of over 250,000 indigenous people in Hispaniola. But by 1517, only 14,000 remained, according to the Oklahoma Medical Research Association. So the question I really want to ask is, why are we as Americans allowing someone like this to define our history? Why are we crediting him to the discovery of America? Why are we crediting him as the founder of America when, quite frankly, he didn't found anything? All he did was bring disease over to the land. All he did was eviscerate and decimate the land of the Americas.
And I think it's interesting you bring up the disease because that is something that is widely talked about when we discuss Columbus and his effects on the Native Americans. I had history.com when I was reading up. They described it as biological warfare, which is no small description of what had happened here. I think it's interesting also you brought up the 250,000 Taino natives. I mean, my God, just absolutely terrible. And I completely agree with you. I think it's fascinating in a pretty unsettling way that this was celebrated in America for so long. I mean, Columbus Day celebrations began in the 1840s, actually, and they actually did not begin in America. They began in Spain. Because that is seen as his home country from the time. So obviously we have a lot of different saddening facts on it, but 50 years go by from the Revolutionary War. And I think it's also important to note that when we talk about the Revolutionary War, the Native Americans were promised a lot of things from the British and the Americans. You had different tribes taking different sides. And at the end of it, during the Treaty of Paris, they were giving squat. They were giving nothing. So they were not able to capitalize on their sacrifices that they made to keep the land that they originally had. But 50 years after the Revolutionary War happens, Andrew Jackson becomes president, and everybody remembers him as somebody that signed the Indian Removal Act. So I think it's important to note with Jackson, too, this wasn't necessarily just a cabinet thing. This is a Jackson thing. Jackson was already making strides to remove Native Americans from the area way before he became president. In 1850, he served as the Federal Treaty Commissioner, and he persuaded natives to sell their land so that Mississippi, Georgia, and literally all of Alabama could be sold to the Americas. So this wasn't an Andrew Jackson president cabinet thing. This was Andrew Jackson, the person. James, if you could talk a little bit more about Jackson and his presidency and maybe the Trail of Tears as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So the Indian Removal Act, like you said, it was an act that was passed almost as like a personal project of Andrew Jackson, and it gave him the power to negotiate with the Native Americans, to relocate them to plantations and reserves that were west of the Mississippi, most notably the Oklahoma Territory, which is most of present-day Oklahoma minus the Panhandle. However, it didn't really take very long for America to sort of go back on that, as the Manifest Destiny and the westward expansion quickly encroached upon the space that they were given. And even today now, like, it got whittled away and commercialized, and now only a small fraction of the area that they were designated exists today. So.
Yeah, Manifest Destiny is something really important to bring up here. That's something that started gaining traction in the 1820s. Although it wasn't coined as a phrase until after Jackson left office, it is very visible in the treatment of Native Americans during his presidency that the Trail of Tears was a result of the idea of Manifest Destiny and the divine right to be across the entire country.
Yeah, and I want to jump on what you were talking about with Manifest Destiny. Obviously, at the time it was talked about the divine right of the Americans, of the settlers, but something that Manifest Destiny, Columbus's travels to the quote unquote Americas, all have in common is this common strain of capitalism and violence to achieve a means. And I think we see this with Columbus, we see this with Jackson, is this idea that they kind of had to play the Native Americans, or they didn't give the Native Americans a fair shot. Like, why are we enslaving people for their gold and cutting their hands off for their gold when we could just trade with them? Why are we forcibly removing people from their homes when we could just trade with them? And with the Trail of Tears, you had what was collectively referred to as the 5 civilized tribes. And those were the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Muskogee, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole. Seminole, thank you. And these tribes were referred to as the 5 civilized tribes because they had adopted European practices to the aim of being able to retain their lands. And I think this is another thing we really have to unpack, is the fact that these people are foregoing their culture and their practices to retain land that they were already on. And I think that is so insane, and it's so infuriating to me that this is a culture and this is a way of life and a government that was imposed upon a group of people without their knowledge, without their consent. And now they're being told, you have to leave. Even if you've adopted our names, you've adopted our language, you've adopted our religion, you still can't stay here.
And I find it interesting too that, sorry, Audrey, that they were assimilating these ideas on their own too for the sake of survival.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think speaking about the Cherokee in particular, we have to, I think, talk about the Treaty of New Okata, sorry. And so that was basically signed by a minority of the Cherokee Nation. It was signed by a couple thousand of, I believe 15, that number could be wrong, but 16,000 Cherokees. So around 1,500 of these Cherokees signed this treaty that said basically that they would move, and they would remove themselves from their land and go across the Mississippi River in exchange for $5 million and preserved space where they're going to be moving to. And Congress jumped on that. They ratified the treaty by just one vote and gave the Cherokees 2 years to remove themselves. And obviously the majority was like, guys, what? No. And so a lot of this removal of the Cherokees, they had to be forcibly removed. They were paraded in stockades. They were rounded up forcefully. Families were separated. The ill and old, elderly, were forced out at gunpoint. It was just a generally awful.
And I find it interesting too about the Indian Removal Act. It goes by that did not give them the right to forcibly remove anybody, actually, according to law. But Jackson would actually force his captains to do so. But I do want to move on to our last topic of the day. Something I find really ironic about Jackson is that he was almost cartoonishly right-wing to a point that he believed in full states' rights. He was a big advocate of secession when it came time for that. So I think it's kind of funny that what he is most remembered for is direct federal influence over a group of people. But luckily, he will be removed starting 2030 from the $20 bill and replaced with Harriet Tubman, which does bring us to the current day. So I would like to tell a quick story. Do you guys remember Gabby Petito, social influencer? Yeah. She was a white woman who was touring the country with her boyfriend, and she went missing in Wyoming. And there was this huge, everyone was on the news trying to find where she went. A month later, her remains are found. I believe her boyfriend or husband or whatever it was charged. That's not the point. The point is that in the area she was found missing in Wyoming, there have been 710 missing indigenous people for years, and 10 of them have been found and their fates have been discovered. So I think when you talk about the current treatment of Native Americans in our country, it has not gotten much better.
And I wish I could say that, and I wish we could all say that the negative treatment of the indigenous people ended with Jackson, but it did not. And I really want to talk about something called assimilation. I know that during Jackson's time, we had these roundup camps and these emigration camps, but that translated into the 18th and 19th century with Native American boarding schools. Now, the concept of this can be traced to Civil War Army Lieutenant Richard Henry Pratt. And together they would basically send Native American people to these boarding schools where they were forced to cut their hair, dress in military uniforms, and learn English. They were being groomed to resemble their captors in an attempt to civilize them.
Yeah, definitely. To jump in, Richard Pratt, his slogan for that was "Kill the Indian, save the man."
Yeah.
Insane propaganda.
It's also important to note too the pollution that we bring to modern day America. I mean, that is just a complete breach of their religion as well. Obviously, nature has a lot to do with Native Americans and their religion. And I think one of the most poignant images in modern day is that Mount Rushmore sits in an area heavily coated in reserves. And it's American presidents looking over the land of the people.
Yeah, and I think it's very good that you bring up pollution just because there's been a lot of talks with climate change and everything of looking to Native American leadership and how they manage their lands, how their ancestors managed their lands, because obviously they were doing better than we're doing right now. And so this idea of not having land ownership and treating the land as one, I think is something that's becoming more prominent in more conversations about climate change.
from back in the
Oh,
day.
so
But
it's time to look to them for leadership.
unfortunately, that is all the time we have for you guys today. We encourage you to do your own research on this topic and truly learn the history behind the settlement of the states. We can't cover it all here, and there's still plenty for you to learn on your own. Our intention is not to make you feel guilty or at fault, but to remind everyone that our past is not always pretty, and our duty as historians is to ensure these kind of mistakes never happen again through vigilance provided by knowledge. We can and we will be better. Back to you.
Thanks, Brandon. Stay tuned for another edition of ATD International. We will meet you back at the desk. We are back at the desk. Let's hand it over to Emma and Ryan to give us all of the latest in international politics. Over to you guys.
Welcome back to ATD International. I'm Emma Goldkoff.
And I'm Ryan Patterson. Italy sent a boat filled with migrants headed to the Italian shore to Albania. 16 men from Egypt and Bangladesh were saved at sea and will apply for Italian asylum in an Albanian detention center, a process that is known to take months. Human rights groups have criticized the Italian government and fear the possibility of human rights violations at the centers. Women, children, and the elderly will not be placed there, and the Italian government assures that no families will be separated in the process.
South Korea has detected signs that North Korea is planning to destroy parts of inner Korean roads that are no longer in use. Tensions are rising since North Korea's claim that South Korea flew drones over their territory. Destroying the roads would further align with leader Kim Jong-un's plan to cut off ties with South Korea. A spokesperson of South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff says the military believes North Korea may stir the pot more, like launching space rockets.
Canada has expelled several Indian diplomats for connections to homicides and extortion of the Canadian Sikh population. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau claims the evidence of Indian government's connection to the assassination of Sikh separatist Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Canadian police believe that India is trying to silence Sikh activists living in Canada. India has expelled their Canadian diplomats in response as the tensions between the two nations continue to rise.
China has sent a record number of aircrafts to conduct military exercises surrounding Taiwan as a warning after Taiwan celebrated the founding of its government last week. Taiwan's Ministry of Defense reported 90 out of China's 125 aircrafts were spotted in Taiwan's defense air zone. China's goal was to make it clear that it wanted to punish Taiwan's president for rejecting Beijing's claim of sovereignty over the self-governed island. That's all for your ATD International Update. Back to you, Sophia.
Thanks, Emma. And sadly, that is all of the time we have for today. In the meantime, stay updated with ATD on all our socials at PSU at the desk, and let us know what you want to see us cover next. I'm Sophia Tabernet, and we will see you back at the desk next week.
Oh.